Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with the Actually Tiny House Project, where we are exploring smart, simple, sustainable tiny house design and giving you some building tips along the way. Now, most of what I want to talk to you about today is how we boxed out the trim around our windows in preparation to apply the siding onto our tiny house here. But before I do that, I want to take a few minutes to talk about all the layers that need to happen before we can get to putting the trim on. Now, the first layer around the tiny house is Tyvek, which is our weather-resistive barrier, and that gets nailed on with cap nails, which are really helpful to keep the Tyvek from ripping while you're putting it up. And then we installed these Marvin Integrity windows and then flashed these off the same way that you would flash off any normal window. Now, the next thing we did after that was add these rain screen battens, which are just narrow plywood battens that get nailed through the weather resistive barrier and into the studs beneath the plywood. And they act as a little spacer to hold the siding away from the house so air can circulate up through and behind the siding, and also so any water that penetrates your siding details can drain down and away from the house. And this is one of those things that might seem like overkill for a tiny house, but if you consider that a lot of tiny houses don't really have much in the way of eaves and they can be exposed to really driving weather forces just like any houses, I think it makes sense to have this extra layer of protection. A good rain screen detail like this, complete with your siding vent, which is these guys right here that are perforated that allow air to move but don't allow insects to come through, is going to run you somewhere between $200 and $300 depending on the size of your tiny house, and probably isn't going to add more than about 100 pounds to a medium-sized tiny house build, and it's only going to add about 3/4 of an inch of width to your overall build. So that's not a huge amount of extra money for a whole lot of extra protection, so that's what we decided to go with here. Now, the way that you would normally put trim on in this situation is you would leave the rain screens off in this area, and you would take wide trim boards and put them on the sides of the windows, and then you would put one on top of the windows as well, and you would have a flashing that comes from underneath the weather resistive barrier over the top of your top trim board and allows the water to continuously drain out and away from the building. And those are just normal flashing details, but it does get a little more complicated when you're talking about rain screens, because you still have to think about how you're going to incorporate this siding vent detail below and on top of where your window goes. And that means leaving appropriately sized little gaps. There's some really great resources online, which I'll link to below, for how to do those buildups. But in the case of what we decided to do here, we decided to go a completely different route with this. Rather than trying to weave our trim in with the weather resistive barrier and then try to leave all the gaps for the siding vent, we decided to leave the weather resistive barrier completely intact around the window and let that be its own unified layer of protection, and then float our window trim on top of that the same way that we did our siding. I should mention that we didn't do this on our corners or on our doors. So for our corners, we are directly to the house wrap, and then the rain screen is butted up against it like you'd normally see a window trim detail. And for the door, it's the same thing. But because we wanted to go with a narrower trim detail on the sides here, we figured it would make a lot more sense to float window boxes on top of the rain screen and siding vent detail. And this has some really distinct advantages, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Most trim you see is wider, but we were looking for a very narrow look. So this is about 1.25 inches wide, although it could be 1 inch or 1.5 inches, and it's 2.5 inches tall, although it could be 3 inches or even more if you can find long enough screws. And I think it just gives kind of a nice look. It's a little more like what we wanted. And then the whole thing is fastened on here with these 3-inch long number 8 fin trim GRK screws, which I'm really fond of right now. I'll put a link to those as well. And if you look at this box here, what you're going to notice is that it is beveled on the top and the bottom. So these stiles that come up the sides here are cut at a 6-degree angle. And then also the top of the window trim and the bottom of the window trim is sitting at a 6-degree angle, which I cut into a parallelogram shape on my table saw. So when this sits in place and the siding comes down directly on top of it here, it channels water out and away from the building, which kind of takes the place of where you would normally see a head flashing without having a head flashing in that location. And the reason it's fine not to have a cap flash in that location is because that's already integrated into the function of the flashing detail on the window. So the two of these are acting as totally separate weather resistant planes. They're not interwoven like you'd normally see. So I've got my box here, and I can put this on, And the first nice thing that you see about doing it this way is I'm not trying to fuss with narrow trim that's sitting on top of lumpy flashing details and trying to screw it into place and not having a 16th gap there or a little gap here and having everything twist all over the place. By screwing this box together at the corners, everything's nice and tight and integrated, and the whole thing just installs as a unit. Now, how I measured this was I measured this 1/8 of an inch wider than the width of the window and 1/4 inch wider than the height of the window. And the reason I did it that way is because the 1/8 of an inch gives you these really narrow gaps on either side that are nice that you can fill with caulk to really make sure that you've got a good seal on either side of the window. Now, the gap on the top and the bottom of the window, which was 1/4 inch, which gets split evenly 1/8 of an inch in both directions, is different than that. It doesn't get caulked. It actually is a channel for air to be able to move through. And not only does that allow air to come in and complete the air channel for the siding vent, but it also gives room for this cap flashing up here that is over the top of the window to drain out if water does get behind your siding at some point. So now that we're accomplishing our venting between the window casing and the trim as opposed to between the siding boards and the trim, it allows us to take our siding boards and push them all the way up the trim for a really tight exterior drainage plane. So overall, I think this is just a really neat way to accomplish this. I feel like it is a safe, legit way to manage boxing out with a narrow trim detail around your window. You'll have to give me your feedback. If you're someone with a lot of experience with these things and you have a different opinion, just like all my videos, I welcome your comments. Let me know what you think, and I'm always interested in learning different or better ways to do things. If you want to check out more of what we do, you can head over to our website, which is actuallytiny.com, and you could also follow us on Instagram, where we post daily blogs of all the building we're doing on our tiny house and also time-lapse videos of all the processes, including flashing these windows, installing the rain screen, and making these boxes right here. Okay, that's it for now. Take care. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.